Hi everyone, this is Michaela Wardeman, and for my article share, I'm going to be talking about area. My article is called This About Covers It, Strategies for Finding Area. And in this article, the title really kind of sums it up. The authors were focusing on area as something being covered with something such as square units or centimeter square units or some kind of square units instead of going off of the area formula. Teachers wanted their students to be able to come up with their own idea for measuring area instead of just jumping right to length times width. They wanted them to be able to find it out on their own, and they were mostly focusing on irregular areas, so students really had to focus on how they were going to come up with the area to their problem. So on the first day, they were looking at a fried egg, as you can see in the pictures here, and teachers were talking to their students about what is going to make more sense to find the area, centimeter square units or inches. And they were discovering that they were going to be more accurate with the smaller squares because they could be more precise on exactly what their area was. And then as students worked through it, some of the things they came up with was that they could find a bunch of whole squares, and then they'd either forget about all of the half squares and not count them, or you had some students that would count all the whole squares and then they'd count every single partial square as a half square when it really wasn't a half a square. So students were coming up with some of their misconceptions and their miscalculations along the way. Then they came up with another one where they were tracing their body and coming up with the area of their body. And then as they did that, kind of the same idea, they were coming up with different strategies of how they could figure out the area. Students were starting to come up with the idea of an array and making a box around weird shaped body parts, and they would find the area of that array, and then they would subtract out the area on the outside to be able to find the area of the inside, and they found that to be easier. Some students were getting better about counting the partial squares and being able to find the whole area of something like their arm on their own. But the main idea then, after they did all of that calculations, was to write down in a journal of the strategies they used, and the teacher was able to go back in there and figure out what students still need help on, or what they were confused about, or how they could help students better. And I liked some of their explanations because they were drawing pictures and trying to explain that way of what they did to find the area of the irregular shapes. I really liked this article. It kind of went right with what an activity I just did in science class with my students, and I can show you what that looks like. In science class, we are talking about how much water is in the world, and my activity with my mystery science unit was talking about the water in the world and breaking it apart with their salt water, frozen fresh water, and their fresh water and the salt water. And they were given maps like this, and they had to count the area. And so students were doing some of those exact same things as in the article. They were coming up with arrays to be able to count their squares. And they didn't have to count partial squares in this activity because this kind of broke up the partial squares for them. But they were definitely having to come up with arrays and different strategies to count, because some students were given larger sections of map and they didn't want to have to count every single square because it was going to take them a while. So I thought this article was really cool because it went right along with some of the maps we were counting in science to figure out how much freshwater, saltwater, and frozen freshwater we had. But I really liked the activity and the fact that they had to come up with their own strategies, and how are they going to count the partial squares and the half squares. So I think I would like to use an activity like this with my students and partner them up with somebody to see what they come up with to be able to solve for partial squares and half squares, because in that science activity that was already done for them, I would like to see what they would come up with to be able to count the half squares and the partial squares. So that's how I would like to use it, and I would love to see their explanation as well in writing, because I don't think we do enough of that in math class, enough writing of explaining how did you solve things and what were your strategies that you used. So that's how I would like to use it. Thanks for listening.